My goal for this lab lesson today is to help you conceptualize the gyri and the sulci that define the surface features of the human brain. When we look at the adult human brain, it's hard to appreciate what is consistent from one specimen to the next and what's different. This lesson is all about the consistencies, and once you conceptualize those consistencies, it will be just a wonderful experience to appreciate what's different from one brain to the next. When you look at the surface features of the brain, the gyri and the sulci, we see patterns, and these patterns are analogous to the fingerprints on each of your digits. Those fingerprints have standard patterns for each digit, but in each individual, of course, we know that our fingerprints are quite distinct. Something similar can be said of the surface features of the cerebral hemispheres. There are, in fact, primary sulci and gyri that are present in every normal human brain. And then there are secondary and tertiary gyri that help define those distinctive qualities of the surface pattern in each cerebral hemisphere. So we're going to focus on those primary sulci and gyri. And I think a great way to conceptualize the organization of the cerebral hemispheres will be to actually allow you to see how I place my fingers on the gyri of the cerebral hemisphere. And I want you to imagine that my fingers are gyri and the space between my fingers are sulci. So let's begin with the central sulcus. The central sulcus is right near the middle of the hemisphere, and it's defined by two roughly parallel gyri, a precentral gyrus and a postcentral gyrus. So my index finger is representing and overlying the precentral gyrus, my middle finger is overlying the postcentral gyrus, and the space between my fingers represents the central sulcus. Now, while I keep those two fingers there, I want to demonstrate for you the remaining gyral features of the frontal lobe. And to do that, what I'm going to do is place three fingers in parallel that are roughly orthogonal to this central sulcus. So I have a finger down below, which is overlying the inferior frontal gyrus, a finger in the middle that's overlying the middle frontal gyrus, and then a finger up on the top of the hemisphere that's representing the superior frontal gyrus. So three fingers representing three roughly parallel gyri that are meeting the central sulcus almost at a right angle, a little bit more obtuse than a right angle. So now let's look at the parietal lobe. I'll reestablish the central sulcus with my left hand. So now my middle finger is representing the precentral gyrus, and my index finger is representing the postcentral gyrus. And to conceptualize the parietal lobe, all I need to do is place two fingers that are running, again, roughly at a right angle to the central sulcus. My index finger is near the dorsal margin of the hemisphere. We call that gyral formation the superior parietal lobule. And my middle finger is just below the superior parietal lobule, representing the inferior parietal lobule. The space between them is a prominent sulcus of the parietal lobe called the intraparietal sulcus. Okay, now let's move to the temporal lobe. In the temporal lobe, just as we did for the frontal lobe, we can conceptualize this lateral surface as being comprised of three long parallel gyri. So we had three long parallel gyri in the frontal lobe, and we have three long parallel gyri in the temporal lobe. We have a superior temporal gyrus, a middle temporal gyrus, and an inferior temporal gyrus. And the two spaces between my three fingers would be the superior temporal sulcus and the inferior temporal sulcus. Now with this specimen, the brainstem and the cerebellum are preventing me from conceptualizing the inferior surface of the brain, so I'm going to opt for an additional specimen to extend the placement of my fingers to the inferior surface of the temporal lobe. In this second specimen, I've removed the brainstem and the cerebellum so that we can have a better view of the inferior surface of the cerebral hemisphere. Now, I just showed you placing 3 fingers along the lateral surface of the temporal lobe, and then to complete the picture of the temporal lobe, I'm just going to lay my additional 2 fingers right along 2 long gyri that we see on this inferior surface. So now I've got 5 fingers on the temporal lobe. On the lateral aspect, I've got a superior temporal gyrus, a middle temporal gyrus, and an inferior temporal gyrus. And then as we look onto the ventral and medial aspect of the temporal lobe, my index finger is representing a long straight gyrus that runs from the temporal lobe back towards the occipital lobe. This is called the occipitotemporal gyrus, and sometimes the posterior part is called the fusiform gyrus. And then my thumb represents a very interesting medial gyrus of the temporal lobe called the parahippocampal gyrus. In fact, the knuckle of